At 17 knots on a course for Bandar Abbas, an Iranian flagged cargo vessel, nearly 900 feet long, a ship weighing almost as much as an American aircraft carrier, crossed into the interception zone of a United States Navy guided missile destroyer in the North Arabian Sea. For 6 hours, that destroyer, the USS Spruance, issued warnings. Not one, not two. 6 hours of escalating radio calls, warning shots, procedural communication, giving the Iranian crew every opportunity to comply. They did not comply. So the Spruance put rounds through the engine room of that vessel. U.S. Marines of the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit fast roped in from helicopters, and for the first time since the opening phase of this war, members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are sitting in United States military custody in the middle of the Arabian Sea. What happened in the last 24 hours is not a diplomatic incident, it is a strategic inflection point. And most of the mainstream coverage you have seen has completely failed to understand what it actually signals. So I want to walk you through this carefully, structurally, because once you see what is actually happening, you will not be able to unsee it. And the implications for the next 48 hours, for the global oil market, for American economic stability, for the trajectory of this entire conflict, are far larger than the ship seizure itself. Let me start with a question that sets the frame. Why did the Islamic Republic send that ship into a known American naval blockade with IRGC personnel on board the night before the most important round of negotiations since this war began? Because here is what the mainstream framing gets wrong. They are treating this as a reckless provocation, an accident, a unit commander acting outside orders. It is none of those things. The Tuska was a test to see whether the American blockade was real or rhetorical, a test to see whether the United States would actually use force against an Iranian flagged commercial vessel hours before sitting down at a negotiating table, a test to see whether Trump's posture is theater or structural. And the answer Iran received was unambiguous. The Americans fired, the Americans boarded, the Americans took prisoners, and the ceasefire, already fragile, broke open along a seam that cannot be stitched back together with a diplomatic statement. Now, let me give you the structural reality of where Iran actually stands right now, because this is the part that reframes everything that follows. Iran is not negotiating from strength. Iran is negotiating from strategic compression. And these are two completely different games. Consider the inventory of losses. The Iranian Air Force degraded to the point where it cannot contest its own airspace. The Iranian Navy, its conventional surface fleet largely neutralized in the opening phase. The IRGC drone and ballistic missile infrastructure struck repeatedly, with production facilities, storage depots, and mobile launcher positions systematically eliminated. Senior IRGC leadership eliminated. The proxy network that was Iran's strategic depth, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Iraqi militias, the Assad remnants, every one of those is under simultaneous pressure. And now the commercial shipping lifeline that funds the entire apparatus is being physically stopped, boarded, and seized in open water. This is what a military planner calls total pressure application. Every axis simultaneously: military, economic, diplomatic, maritime, cyber, intelligence. There's no slack in the system for Tehran. There is nowhere to pivot, no proxy to activate, no back channel that produces relief. And here's where it gets genuinely dangerous. Because a regime under total compression does not behave like a rational actor optimizing outcomes. It behaves like a cornered animal optimizing for a response that demonstrates it is still alive. And that distinction between rational escalation and what game theorists call costly signaling is the single most important analytical frame for understanding what the next 48 hours actually look like. What Iran says it wants, the lifting of the blockade and the release of seized personnel. What Iran actually needs, a visible act of defiance significant enough to preserve the regime's domestic legitimacy and the IRGC's internal coherence. Those two things are not the same, and the gap between them is where the danger lies. Because a regime that needs to demonstrate it is still dangerous will choose the target that produces the largest visible response for the smallest strategic cost, not a direct attack on an American carrier. That is suicide, not a missile strike on the US mainland. That is a fantasy. It is something asymmetric. A drone that gets through at an Arab Gulf infrastructure site, a Houthi strike on a commercial tanker that forces the insurance markets to panic, a cyber operation against critical infrastructure. Something that says, we are still here, we still have teeth, the blockade has not silenced us. Iran has already moved in that direction. Following the Tauska seizure, the IRGC launched drones at US naval vessels. They did not cause significant damage. That is not the metric. The metric is that they fired. They crossed the threshold. The question every serious analyst in Washington and Tampa is asking right now is not whether that was the retaliation, it is whether that was the opening move. Now, let me show you what the American side of this looks like because this is where the picture becomes clarifying. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has officially returned to the Middle East, operating alongside two destroyers, the USS Mahan and the USS Winston S. Churchill. The USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group is already positioned just outside the Gulf of Oman. The USS George H.W. Bush is inbound, expected to arrive within days. 3 carrier strike groups, converging on the same maritime theater. Let me put that in context for you. The United States Navy operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. At any given time, only a portion are deployed. The rest cycle through maintenance, training, and workup. Deploying 3 of them simultaneously to a single theater is not routine rotation. It is not messaging. It is not show of force in the diplomatic sense. It is the mathematical precondition for sustained multi-axis combat operations. 3 carriers gives you a continuous strike tempo. 1 on station delivering sorties, 1 regenerating, 1 in transit, with enough mass to sustain a full air campaign for weeks without degradation. This is not how you posture. This is how you prepare. And the ceasefire, the fragile, already violated instrument that has been the only thing separating the current pause from full resumption of hostilities, expires in 48 hours. Now, let's talk about what Trump said today. Because the coverage of his Truth Social statement has been almost comically superficial. They are treating it as a tweet. It was not a tweet, it was a written military ultimatum from the Commander-in-Chief of the United States on the record in public with a specific target set. Quote, "We are offering a fair and reasonable deal. I hope they take it. If they don't, the United States will knock out every single power plant and bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy. It is time for the Iran killing machine to end. Every single power plant, every bridge." That is not rhetoric. That is a target category. Iran's electrical grid runs approximately 80 major generation facilities, heavily centralized, already stressed from years of sanctions-driven maintenance shortfalls. You eliminate that grid, and you do not just inconvenience the civilian population. You blind the radar networks that depend on it. You sever the command and control communications that coordinate mobile missile launchers. You collapse the fuel refining capacity that keeps the IRGC operational. You end the regime's ability to run a modern military. Bridges are the second half of that equation. Iran's geography is mountainous, rugged, and heavily dependent on a finite number of road corridors to move military equipment. The mobile ballistic missile launchers that have been the single most dangerous element of Iran's arsenal throughout this war. The ones disguised as civilian trucks, the ones that deploy, fire, and vanish, those platforms depend on bridges. Crater the bridge network in key corridors, and the mobile force posture that defines Iranian deterrence turns into a set of stationary targets. And stationary targets in a theater with 3 carrier groups and a stealth surveillance platform running 24-hour sorties overhead do not survive long. The target set is not theater. The target set is the logic of finishing a degradation campaign that has already done most of the work. But here's where the calculation gets genuinely hard. And I want to be honest with you about this, because the channels that are not honest with you about this are not doing serious analysis. Iran has 90 million people. The overwhelming majority of them want this regime gone, not speculation. Confirmed by every credible internal poll, every wave of protest that has been met with live ammunition in the streets, every defection, every leaked regime document that shows the security services terrified of their own population. The Iranian people are structurally the natural ally in this conflict. The regime is not the people. The IRGC is not Iran. And that is the problem with the power plant strategy. You switch off the lights in Tehran and the hospitals go dark. The water treatment stops. The elevators in apartment towers freeze. Ordinary Iranian families sitting in the summer heat with no electricity and no running water do not blame the regime that brought this on them. They blame the country whose jets are overhead. You risk inverting the political logic of the entire war. You risk giving the regime a new narrative that unifies the population around an external enemy at the exact moment the population was turning inward against the Islamic Republic itself. That is the real debate inside the Pentagon and the White House right now. Not whether the military can do it. The military absolutely can do it. The question is whether doing it wins the war or saves the regime. This is the sophistication that a mainstream coverage will not give you. This is the real conversation. Now, let me turn to what this means for you, because this is not just a Middle East story. This is an American economic story, and the connection is direct and measurable. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day, roughly 17 million barrels. The strait is currently closed. Iran has announced that only vessels with IRGC naval force approval will transit, which in practical terms means it is shut to the global commercial fleet until the blockade is lifted. That is not a hypothetical disruption. That is an active one happening right now as you watch this. Here's the cost math in a form nobody on cable news will give you. In the 1973 oil embargo, global oil prices quadrupled in a matter of months. The American economy went into recession. Gasoline lines wrapped around city blocks. The inflation shock reshaped American economic policy for a generation. That embargo happened in peacetime. There was no active military conflict. There were no carrier strike groups in theater. There was no regime on the brink launching drones at American warships. The pressure in the current system is structurally higher than 1973. And yet the market has not fully priced that in, because markets are bad at pricing tail events until the tail event becomes undeniable. The second it becomes undeniable, you get repricing that moves in a matter of hours, not days. Oil at $120, $140, $160 a barrel is not a projection I am inventing. It is a range that mainstream investment banks have quietly published in their scenario analysis for a full Hormuz disruption, combined with strikes on Gulf infrastructure. What does that mean for you? Gasoline above $6 a gallon in coastal states. Diesel shock that moves through every freight-dependent sector, which is every sector because everything you buy gets there on a truck. Heating costs this winter that land on household budgets that are already strained. A Federal Reserve that loses the inflation progress it has spent the last 2 years fighting for, with no easy path to respond without breaking the labor market, and an equity market that historically reacts to energy shocks by compressing multiples across every interest rate sensitive sector, which is where a large portion of your retirement account actually lives. Let me put that in one sentence. A 2-week closure of the Strait of Hormuz, combined with Iranian strikes on Gulf oil infrastructure, is arguably the single most inflationary event that could hit the American economy in the current cycle. It is not priced in, and the window in which it becomes real is the next 48 hours. Now, here's the question nobody in mainstream coverage is asking, and it is possibly the most important question of the entire episode. The IRGC personnel in US custody, what do they know? The reason IRGC representatives were on board the Tauska in the first place is that the regime does not trust its own civilian crews. They were installed as monitors, enforcers, regime eyes. which means they are not deckhands. They are operational personnel with access to IRGC communications protocols, the chain of command that governs the sanctions evasion shipping network, the financial architecture that moves revenue from crude exports through shadow banking into the Revolutionary Guard budget, the coordination channels between Tehran and Houthi forces, the technical parameters of the escort operations that have been running these vessels for years. If that intelligence is now in American hands, the seizure of the Tauska is not a show of force. It is the single most significant intelligence collection event of this entire war. And that is not something the Islamic Republic can accept, because once that information enters the American analytical pipeline, it cascades into sanctions enforcement, asset freezes, targeting packages, and proxy disruption operations that compound pressure on the regime for months. Which is why the retaliation threat is not rhetorical. It is structural. Tehran has to respond, not because they want to, because the internal logic of the regime requires it. A regime whose personnel can be taken prisoner without consequence is a regime that has lost its monopoly on force in its own name. And that is an existential problem for an authoritarian system that rules through fear. The question is not whether retaliation comes. The question is what shape it takes and whether the Americans absorb the first blow, diplomatically useful, politically costly, or whether the three carrier groups already on station make the decision for them. Let me give you the historical frame, because history does not announce itself. It arrives dressed as current events that people dismiss as noise. The Athenians launched the Sicilian expedition in 415 BC. The largest, best equipped naval force in the ancient Mediterranean, sent to crush a distant enemy they were convinced would fold under pressure. The expedition ended in total catastrophe. The Athenian navy was destroyed. The army surrendered. Most of the soldiers died in Syracusan stone quarries. Athens itself never fully recovered, and the Peloponnesian War was effectively decided by that single overextension, not because the Athenians were weak, because the enemy, when cornered and fighting on its own ground, fought with a desperation that defied the strategic logic that had worked everywhere else. Rome fought Persia for 3 centuries and never resolved it. The Mongols conquered Persia and became Persian. Every great power that has tried to impose a clean, decisive outcome on the Iranian plateau has discovered that the geography, the demographics, and the cultural depth of that civilization produce outcomes no strategic plan can predict. I am not telling you the United States will fail. The United States has capabilities that no previous power in this position has ever possessed. I am telling you that the question of what happens when the world's greatest military applies maximum pressure to a regime with nothing left to lose is a question that does not have a clean historical answer. And anyone telling you they know how this ends is selling you certainty that does not exist. What I can tell you is the structure. The ceasefire expires in 48 hours. The peace talks have collapsed. 3 carrier strike groups are in position. Iran has launched drones at American warships and vowed retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. IRGC personnel are in U.S. custody. And Trump has issued an ultimatum that he has every demonstrated intention of following through on, because the pattern of this entire conflict has been that when he says something, he does it. What to watch? If Iran makes any move toward back-channel re-engagement through Oman, through Qatar, through any third party, the ultimatum is working as leverage, and the ceasefire may extend. If the 48 hours expire with no signal from Tehran, or if Iranian retaliation lands in a way that forces a response, you will know within hours what the next phase looks like. Watch the oil tape, watch insurance rates on Gulf shipping, watch for any unusual movement at Al Udeid, at Manama, at the forward positions in the UAE. The signals will be there before the headlines catch up. Most of the people in your life are going to scroll past this. They're going to see ship seized and move on to the next thing. They are not tracking the carrier. Dispositions. They are not thinking about what a Hormuz closure does to their gas prices, their 401k, their mortgage environment. They are not asking what the IRGC prisoners know. They are not seeing the shape of what is actually happening. That is the story underneath the story. That is what this channel exists to cover. And we'll be here for every chapter of what comes next. So I will leave you with the question: who holds the stronger hand right now? Washington or Tehran? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.